A dispatcher picks up the phone, and within seconds, they realize something is very, very wrong. The voice on the other end isn't panicked in the way you'd expect. It's controlled, almost calm, like the caller knows exactly what they're doing. Now imagine this. What if some of the most chilling crimes weren't discovered by detectives, but were literally announced live through a 911 call? Tonight, you're about to hear stories that didn't just shock investigators. They stayed with them long after the cases were closed, or in some cases, never solved at all. Before we go deeper, if you enjoy real, unsettling stories like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe to The Dark Brief, because the stories you'll hear here aren't just true, they leave questions that don't go away. The first call came in just after midnight. A woman's voice, steady but quiet, told the operator that something terrible had happened. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply said, "I think someone's dead." The dispatcher immediately asked where she was, trying to assess the urgency. But instead of answering directly, the caller hesitated, like she was choosing her words very carefully. Investigators later said that pause, that small moment of silence, was one of the first red flags. When officers arrived, they found exactly what she had described, a body lying in the living room. But what didn't match was her behavior. Witnesses said she appeared strangely detached, almost as if she had already processed everything long before making that call. The haunting part? When detectives reviewed the recording, they noticed subtle inconsistencies, tiny details that didn't align with the scene. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. That calm tone would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. Another call came from a young man who sounded completely out of breath. He told the operator someone had broken into his house. You could hear movement, doors opening and closing, the sound of something crashing in the background. It felt real, urgent, terrifying. But then something changed. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line and describe what was happening, and suddenly his answers became scripted, almost like he was reading from something. Investigators later discovered there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no evidence of an intruder. The entire call appeared to have been staged. What made it worse was what they found next. The timeline didn't match. The events he described had already happened before he even dialed 911. That realization flipped the entire case. The call that was supposed to be a cry for help became a piece of evidence. Then there was the call that many investigators still refused to listen to again. A child's voice, barely above a whisper. The operator tried to keep them calm, asking simple questions. Where are you? Are you safe? But the answers didn't make sense. The child wasn't asking for help in a typical way. Instead, they kept repeating the same phrase, over and over. Something that sounded more like a warning than a request. When authorities traced the call, what they found raised more questions than answers. The location was real, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of the child, no disturbance, no evidence anyone had even been there. The call log existed, the recording existed, but the person on the other end seemed to vanish completely. To this day, that call remains one of those cases that investigators don't talk about openly, because there's nothing to conclude, only unanswered questions. One of the most chilling patterns in these calls is something experts refer to as emotional mismatch. It's when the words and the tone don't align. A person might describe something horrific, but their voice doesn't carry fear or urgency or shock. It's subtle, but once you notice it, it's impossible to ignore. In one case, a caller reported that their partner had been attacked. They gave detailed information, too detailed. The kind of detail that someone in panic usually wouldn't be able to provide so clearly. Later analysis revealed something disturbing. The sequence of events they described wasn't how things actually happened. It was how someone would describe it if they already knew the outcome. That call became a turning point, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it exposed. Another case involved a man who called 911 claiming he had just witnessed a tragic accident. His voice cracked at all the right moments. He sounded believable, convincing, but something felt off. The dispatcher couldn't explain it at the time, but later said there was a strange rhythm to the way he spoke, like he was performing rather than reacting. When investigators reconstructed the scene, they found evidence that contradicted his story. The accident hadn't just happened. It had been set up. And the call? It wasn't a reaction. It was part of the plan. That realization changed how investigators approached similar cases moving forward, because it proved something unsettling. A 911 call isn't always a moment of truth. Sometimes it's the beginning of a lie. There are also calls that haunt for a different reason, not because they reveal guilt, but because they capture the final moments of someone who knew something was wrong, but didn't understand just how serious it was. In one case, a caller reported hearing strange noises outside their home. They weren't scared at first, just confused. The dispatcher tried to reassure them, suggesting it could be something harmless. But as the call continued, the tone shifted. You could hear the realization set in. The pauses grew longer. The voice became quieter. And then the line went silent. What investigators later discovered turned that call into one of the most unsettling recordings they had ever reviewed. Because it wasn't just evidence, it was a timeline, a real-time record of someone going from calm to concerned to something far worse. What makes these calls so powerful is that they're unfiltered. There's no editing, no second take, just raw moments captured exactly as they happened. And sometimes those moments reveal more than any investigation ever could. One investigator once said that you can learn more from a single 911 call than from hours of interviews, because in those first few seconds, people haven't had time to think, to plan, to hide. It's instinct, and instinct is hard to fake. But what happens when someone does fake it? When they prepare for that moment? When the call itself becomes part of a larger story? That's where things get complicated, because now investigators aren't just solving a crime, they're decoding a performance. There was a case where a caller repeatedly insisted they had no idea what had happened. They kept saying, "I just got here." Over and over, almost too much. And that repetition became the key. Because when people tell the truth, they don't usually feel the need to convince you, they just explain. But when someone is trying to shape a narrative, they emphasize, they repeat, they control the story. That call, like many others, didn't just raise suspicion, it guided the entire investigation. As you listen to these stories, one thing becomes clear. The most haunting part isn't always the crime itself. It's the moment someone decides to pick up the phone, because in that moment, they're not just asking for help. They're revealing something, sometimes intentionally, sometimes without even realizing it. And that's why, even years later, these calls are still studied, still analyzed, still replayed. Not because investigators enjoy it, but because they have to. Because somewhere in those recordings is a detail that matters. So the next time you hear a calm voice describing something that should be anything but calm, or a frantic caller whose story feels just a little too perfect, remember this: not every 911 call is what it seems. Some are cries for help, some are carefully constructed, and some are something in between. Right before we end, I want to hear your thoughts. Which type of call do you think is more disturbing? The ones that sound too calm, or the ones that feel almost staged? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story made you think differently about what really happens behind emergency calls, share this video with someone who loves real chilling mysteries. Because here on The Dark Brief, the stories don't just end when the call disconnects. Sometimes that's where they truly begin.